There's a specific mathematical pattern to how superpowers die, and it happens in exactly 6 stages. France went through it in 1789, Russia went through it in 1917, Cuba went through it in 1959, and right now the United States isn't just looking at the pattern from a distance, we are living it. We aren't at stage 1, we aren't at stage 2. According to the historical math, America is currently sitting deep in stage 4. And if you know what happens in stages 5 and 6, you know why we should be terrified. If you think that sounds dramatic or paranoid, you need to look at the numbers, because the math doesn't care about your feelings or your patriotism. In 1789 France, the absolute center of Western civilization, wealthy, cultured, and powerful, yet within 5 years the king was headless and the streets of Paris were being washed with wine and blood. In 1917, the Russian Empire was a 300-year-old dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, yet in 8 months it vanished completely, wiped off the map by a group of guys who started out meeting in basements. In 1959 Cuba, Havana was the Las Vegas of the Caribbean, a neon-soaked paradise of American tourists and money, and 2 years later it was a communist fortress pointing nuclear missiles at Florida. 3 different centuries, 3 different countries, 3 completely different political systems. But if you strip away the flags and the slogans, they all followed the exact same 6-stage cycle of collapse. It is a historical algorithm, and the terrifying part isn't that it happened to them. The terrifying part is that when you overlay that template onto the United States in 2025, we aren't heading toward the cliff. We're already in midair. This is the story of that pattern, how it works, why governments never see it coming until the roof is on fire, and why the history books suggest we are about to have a very interesting decade. To understand how this machine works, you have to understand that revolutions are not random events. They don't just happen because people are having a bad day. They happen when the pressure inside a society exceeds the structural integrity of its institutions. Stage 1 is always the same. It is what historians call visible insulting inequality. Note the word insulting because poverty alone doesn't cause revolutions. If poverty caused revolutions, North Korea would have overthrown its government decades ago. Revolutions happen when the gap between the elites and the reality of the common man becomes so massive that it feels like a glitch in the simulation. In 1789 France, the nobility and the clergy made up about 2% of the population, yet they owned 35% of the land and paid absolutely 0 taxes. The entire tax burden fell on the peasants, who were spending 88% of their income just to buy bread, which is a great business model if you're the king, but a terrible one if you enjoy keeping your head attached to your body. In 1959 Cuba, Havana was a playground for American celebrities and mobsters, while the rural countryside lived in medieval conditions without electricity or running water. In every single collapse, the elites convince themselves that their wealth is proof of their brilliance. They retreat into bubbles, they build their own versions of Versailles or gated communities, and they tell themselves that everything is fine because everyone they know is rich. Today, in the United States, the top 0.1% of households own roughly the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90% combined. The wealth gap right now is actually mathematically wider than it was in France before the revolution, which is quite an achievement when you think about it. We have billionaires racing private rockets into space, while the people working in their warehouses are peeing in bottles because they aren't allowed bathroom breaks. That is the kind of energy that builds stage 1. But inequality is just the fuel. You still need a spark, and that brings us to stage 2. Stage 2 is systemic incompetence, or to put it more simply, it is when the government stops working. It is not just that the leaders are corrupt. Corruption is normal. People expect politicians to steal a little off the top, like a waiter taking a fry from your plate on the way to the table. Stage 2 is different. It is when the corruption becomes so heavy that the government loses the ability to solve even the most basic problems. In France, King Louis XVI wasn't an evil mastermind, he was just a bit dim. He was the 18th century version of a middle manager who fails upwards. When France went bankrupt, his only solution was to borrow more money and raise taxes on the poor because the rich nobles simply refused to pay and the king was too weak to force them. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was personally leading the army into disastrous defeats in World War I, while his government back home was being run by his wife and a mystic wizard named Rasputin, which sounds like the plot of a bad fantasy novel, but was actually the government of a nuclear power. In Cuba, the dictator Batista was so corrupt that even the mafia started complaining about his cut. The common thread here is paralysis. When a government can no longer pave the roads, stop the crime, or balance a budget, the people stop seeing it as a government and start seeing it as a parasite. In the United States today, we have a $36 trillion national debt, a Congress with a 15% approval rating, and a bureaucracy that takes 5 years to approve a permit to fix a bridge. When the people realize that the driver of the bus is asleep at the wheel and also drunk, they don't just get annoyed, they start looking for the emergency exit. This leads directly to stage 3, and this is the most important part that most people get wrong. Stage 3 is the radicalization of the middle class. We're taught in school that revolutions are started by the starving poor with pitchforks, but that is almost never true. The poor are usually too busy trying to survive to organize a complex political movement. Revolutions are almost always led by the educated middle class who feel betrayed. The French Revolution wasn't led by peasants, it was led by lawyers like Robespierre and Danton. The Cuban Revolution was led by Fidel Castro, who was a wealthy attorney from a good family. The Russian Revolution was driven by university students and intellectuals. Why does this happen? Because the system breaks its promise to them. These are people who did everything right. They went to school, they followed the rules, they got the degrees, but the corruption of stage 2 blocked their future. When you have a generation of educated young people who cannot afford homes, cannot start families, and are drowning in debt, you are manufacturing revolutionaries on an assembly line. They have the intelligence to organize the movement, and they have the anger to burn it down. Think about the modern United States. We have millions of college graduates working in coffee shops, drowning in student loans, looking at housing prices that have tripled in a decade. They are realizing that the American dream is mathematically impossible for them, and that realization is dangerous because a lawyer with no future is much scarier than a peasant with no bread. Once the middle class turns, you hit stage 4, which is the loss of institutional faith. This is the psychological breaking point. It is the moment when the people stop believing that the system can be fixed from the inside. In 1917, Russian soldiers didn't shoot their officers, they just stopped listening to them. They realized that the Tsar's authority was a fiction that only existed because they agreed to believe in it, and once they stopped believing, the power evaporated. In Cuba, the people knew the elections were rigged, so they stopped voting and started buying guns. In America today, trust in the media is at an all-time low, trust in the Supreme Court is shattering, and trust in the electoral process depends entirely on whether your side won. Half the country believes the last election was stolen, and the other half believes the system is fascist. When you can no longer win an argument with a vote, the only option left is a weapon. Stage 4 is the dead silence before the thunder. It is the moment when the social contract is torn up and thrown in the trash. The people divide into tribes and they stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as enemies occupying the same territory. Then comes stage 5, the rise of the alternative. Nature abhors a vacuum, and as the legitimate government weakens, new radical groups step in to fill the void. These groups always promise simple solutions to complex problems because desperate people do not want nuance, they want answers. In Russia, the Bolsheviks promised 3 things: peace, land, and bread. That was their entire slogan. It was catchy, it was simple, and it worked. In France, the Jacobins promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. In Cuba, Castro promised to give the land back to the farmers. At this stage, the moderates are silenced. If you try to stand in the middle of the road and argue for compromise, you get run over by both sides. The population polarizes into 2 hostile camps, and the alternative government begins to look like a real government in waiting. They build their own media ecosystems, their own militias, and their own reality. In the US, we're seeing the early versions of this now with groups on the extreme left and extreme right gaining mass support that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. They're no longer fringe, they're becoming the main event. And finally, we arrive at stage 6. The collapse. It usually happens much faster than anyone expects. In all three examples, the regimes looked solid right up until the moment they evaporated. It takes a spark, a food riot, a police shooting, a protest that goes wrong, and suddenly the inferno is out of control. The old government, hollowed out by incompetence and abandoned by its defenders, simply crumbles. But here's the cruel joke of history: the pattern within the pattern. The revolution never delivers what it promised. The French got the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, where 40,000 people were executed in a year, and the streets of Paris smelled like a slaughterhouse.